Bennett Voss thought he was saving his wife $300. He had no idea he was about to embarrass her in front of the two people who controlled the future of a company worth $50 billion on the worst day of her life, 20 minutes before her flight home from her mother's funeral. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. To understand how a good man made such a small, damaging mistake, you have to understand how Bennett and Junie Voss actually lived, because it wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the kind of marriage anyone would have guessed hid a secret that size. They rented the top half of a duplex on Furwood Street in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of street where the porches sag a little and everyone knows whose dog barks at 6 in the morning. Bennett managed logistics scheduling for a regional trucking firm, the kind of job where you spend all day moving other people's freight around a map and come home too tired to talk about it. Junie taught piano lessons 3 afternoons a week out of their spare bedroom and worked the other 2 days as a music therapist at a hospice center 20 minutes away, sitting with dying people and playing them the songs from their childhoods. She was good at sitting with hard things. She had been doing it her whole life, in more ways than her husband knew. They had been married 6 years. It was, by most ordinary measures, a fine marriage, not dramatic, not showy, built on small routines. Bennett made coffee every morning because Junie couldn't stand the sound of the grinder before 8. Junie kept a running list on the refrigerator of things Bennett forgot, not out of resentment, just habit, the way some couples develop a shorthand for managing each other's weak spots. He was careful with money to the point of anxiety. She was careful with feelings to the point of secrecy. Neither of them thought of these traits as flaws. They just were what they were. What Bennett didn't know, what almost no one in Dayton knew, was that Junie's mother, Dorothea Kessler, had spent 40 years quietly building one of the largest privately held freight and logistics networks in the country. Dorothea had started with a single truck in 1983, hauling apples out of the orchards near Traverse City, Michigan, and by the time she was 68 she controlled a holding company most people had never heard of, because she had never once put her name on it. She called it Northgate Freight Systems, and she kept it that way on purpose. She used to tell Junie, when Junie was a teenager complaining about not having the same shoes as the other girls, that money changes how people look at you before they've even said hello to you, and she wasn't interested in raising a daughter who got looked at that way. So Junie grew up in a house with hand-me-down furniture and a mother who worked 80-hour weeks, and she never fully understood the size of what her mother had built until she was an adult signing paperwork she barely read, paperwork that made her, quietly, one of the wealthiest people in the Midwest, without a single reporter, neighbor, or in-law ever knowing it. She had told Bennett almost none of this. Not because she didn't trust him, she told herself that for years, but because early in their relationship, before they were married, he had once talked for 20 minutes about a college roommate whose family had money, how uncomfortable it made him, how he never knew if people like that were being nice to you or performing for you. Junie had listened to that and quietly decided she would rather he love her as a piano teacher's daughter than spend their whole marriage wondering if he loved her or her mother's balance sheet. It felt, at the time, like protecting something. Later, it would feel more like a wall she built and then forgot she had built it. Dorothea Kessler died on a Tuesday in March, of a stroke, in the kitchen of the farmhouse she still refused to leave despite her accountant's endless requests that she move somewhere with better security. She was 74. Junie got the call from Marguerite Odom, her mother's oldest friend and the woman who had basically run the household side of Dorothea's life for 30 years, while Junie was in the middle of a piano lesson with a 9-year-old named Casey who was struggling with a Clementi sonatina. Junie remembers setting the phone down very carefully on the piano lid, the way you set something down when your hands don't quite trust themselves anymore, and telling Casey that they'd have to finish the lesson another day. She flew out that same evening, commercial, coach class, the way she always flew, with one carry-on and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. Bennett drove her to the airport, held her hand in the security line longer than the line technically allowed, and told her he'd handle everything at home so she didn't have to think about bills or the dog or anything small while she was grieving something enormous. It was, in its way, a real kindness. He meant it fully. The funeral was held on a cold, wet Saturday at a small Lutheran church outside Traverse City, the kind with folding chairs set up in the fellowship hall afterward and a coffee urn that always runs out too early. Junie stood at the front in a coat that had belonged to her mother, because packing for a funeral is a strange, hollow task and she hadn't had the heart to buy something new. People she didn't recognize kept approaching her, truck drivers who'd worked for Northgate for 25 years, a woman who ran 3 of the regional depots, a man named Roman Castellano who introduced himself only as the estate's attorney and asked, gently, if they could speak briefly sometime in the next few days, nothing urgent, just logistics. Junie nodded and shook hands and thanked people for coming and did not, for most of the day, allow herself to actually feel any of it. It was Marguerite who finally got her to sit down, in the third pew, an hour after the service ended, and put a paper cup of that 2-week coffee in her hands. Marguerite was 71, wore a rose-colored suit that still had the faint shape of the 80s in its shoulders, and had known Junie since Junie was 7 years old and used to fall asleep under her mother's desk at the original depot office. She would be furious you're still standing, Marguerite said. Sit down before you fall down. I don't know how to do any of this, Junie admitted, and it was the first honest thing she'd said out loud all day. The company, the funeral, none of it. I've spent my whole life trying to be someone this doesn't happen to. Marguerite didn't offer a lot of comfort in words. She wasn't that kind of woman. She just sat next to her for a long while, both of them looking at the church's plain wooden cross, and eventually said, you don't have to know how to do it today. You just have to get through today. The trouble was, getting through the next day required Junie to stay 2 extra nights in Traverse City, because Roman Castellano's brief logistics conversation turned into 3 separate meetings, one with the estate's tax attorneys, one with the board of Northgate's holding structure, who needed Junie's signature to keep freight moving on schedules that, if disrupted, would have cost the company millions and put nearly 900 drivers' routes into chaos, and one, quietly, with Ansel Fitch, the pilot who had flown Dorothea Kessler for 11 years and who now sat across from Junie in the farmhouse kitchen with tears he wasn't bothering to hide, asking her what she wanted done with the plane. It was Ansel who arranged Junie's return flight home. Not because anyone was trying to spoil her or show off, but because the meetings had run long, because there was a board call scheduled the following Monday that needed her present and rested, and because commercial flights out of the small regional airport near Traverse City that weekend were either full or routed through 2 layovers that would have had her home well after midnight, exhausted, the day before she had to sign documents that would determine the jobs of hundreds of people. Ansel booked her on the company's plane out of the small private aviation terminal on the edge of town, sent the confirmation to her email the way he always had for her mother, and thought nothing more of it. Back in Dayton, Bennett Voss was doing exactly what he told Junie he would do. He was handling things. He paid the electric bill 3 days early. He walked their elderly neighbor's dog twice because her hip was bothering her. And on Friday night, going through the shared email account they used for travel and household accounts, an account he checked obsessively, the way some men check sports scores, he found a confirmation email for a return flight booked under an unfamiliar company name, Northgate Aviation Services, for a flight leaving from a private terminal he'd never heard of, at a price listed as $0, with a note that simply said reserved per DK estate instructions. Bennett stared at that email for a long time. He did not know who DK was. He did not recognize the company. What he saw was a strange, unfamiliar charge tied to his wife's name during the most vulnerable week of her life, at an airport that sounded, to him, exactly like the kind of thing scammers used to target grieving families. He had, in fact, read an article just that winter about fraudulent estate services, preying on people during funerals, charging fake fees, collecting personal information. He didn't call Junie right away because he didn't want to alarm her during her mother's Memorial Week. He decided, the way he decided most things, quietly and on his own, that he would simply fix it before she noticed. He canceled the reservation. He booked her instead on a commercial flight the next morning out of the main regional airport, a flight he paid for himself, in coach, with a middle seat, because it was the only one left, and he felt, honestly, a little proud of himself for catching it. He sent her a text, booked you a normal flight home tomorrow, the other one looked like a scam, don't worry about anything, just get some rest. Junie didn't see the text until the next morning, because she had fallen asleep at the farmhouse kitchen table sometime after midnight going through a box of her mother's old ledgers with Marguerite, and her phone had been buried in her coat pocket, silenced. The next morning was gray and drizzling, the kind of March weather that never quite decides whether it wants to be winter or spring. Junie arrived at the private terminal at 8:15 with her small suitcase, wearing the pale blue dress she'd packed for the last of the meetings, her mother's tan coat over her arm, expecting to find Ansel waiting by the plane the way he always was. Instead she found the gate attendant frowning at a screen, telling her, apologetically, that the reservation under her name had been cancelled the night before, by the account holder, and that unfortunately the aircraft had already been released back to standby for another client. That was the moment Bennett came running across the tarmac. He had woken up early, unable to sleep, worried about her flying alone through a connection, and had decided, again, quietly, again without asking, to drive the 3.5 hours from Dayton to Traverse City overnight so he could be there in person to make sure she got on the real flight safely and didn't get talked into anything by whoever was running that scam. He had not slept. He had gas station coffee shaking in his hand. And when he pulled up to what he thought was the wrong terminal and saw his wife standing near a private jet with a red carpet still rolled out from the last passenger, with an older man in a navy suit and a woman in a pink jacket and a driver he didn't recognize all turning to look at him, he did the only thing his exhausted, panicked brain could think to do. He ran toward her, arm out, already talking before he reached her, already trying to warn her, already sure he was about to save her from something. "Junie, don't get on that thing, I already told you, I canceled it, it's not safe, whoever these people are." He stopped talking when he saw her face. Junie has told the story since, quietly, to only a few people, and she says the strange part wasn't anger. It was the specific, private humiliation of watching her husband, a good man, a careful man, a man she loved, accidentally reveal, in the middle of a business tarmac in front of her mother's attorney and her mother's oldest friend and the pilot who had just buried a woman he'd worked beside for 11 years, that he had absolutely no idea who his wife actually was. Roman Castellano's expression didn't change much, because lawyers who handle estates that size learn not to react visibly to much of anything. Marguerite's face did something softer and sadder. Ansel just looked down at his shoes. "Bennett," Junie said, and her voice came out very flat, very tired. "That's Northgate's plane. My mother's plane. It's fine." It was fine. "Whose plane?" Bennett said, not as a question really, more like a word he was trying out to see if it made sense. "My mother's company," Junie said. "The one I run now, apparently, as of about 4 days ago." She looked at the small suitcase by her feet, and then at her husband, standing there in yesterday's clothes with coffee stains on his cuff, having driven 3.5 hours through the night to save her from a threat that didn't exist. "You canceled my flight," she said, and it wasn't loud. "You canceled the flight my mother's company arranged so I could get home in time for a board call that decides whether 900 drivers keep their routes, because you thought it looked suspicious." There is no dramatic gasp in this story. Nobody fainted. Nobody yelled. Roman Castellano, after a beat, simply said, in the mild, practiced voice of a man used to defusing much larger crises, that there was actually a commercial flight leaving from the main terminal in 40 minutes if they hurried, and that he'd have his assistant hold the Monday call until early afternoon regardless. Ansel quietly offered to drive them both, since his car was closer than Bennett's. And Junie, after a long moment standing on that tarmac in the drizzle, picked her suitcase back up. Bennett didn't say much on the drive. He kept starting sentences and not finishing them. Somewhere around the second mile he managed, "You never told me," and Junie, looking out the window at the wet orchards going by, said, "I know. I should have. I told myself I was protecting us. I think mostly I was protecting me." They made the commercial flight with 6 minutes to spare, sat 2 rows apart because it was the only way to get seats on short notice, and didn't talk much on the way home either. Some silences aren't cold. Some are just full. What happened over the following weeks wasn't a miracle, and Kindness Corner viewers who've been with this channel a while know that's usually where these stories are more honest than people expect. Junie didn't quit her hospice job the next day and become a corporate executive in a power suit. Bennett didn't get a sudden windfall and buy her something extravagant to apologize. What actually happened was slower and harder than that, and probably more useful to talk about. Junie flew back to Traverse City twice a month for the next several months, learning a business she'd spent 30 years deliberately not learning, sitting in conference rooms with men twice her age who kept underestimating her right up until they didn't anymore. She kept teaching piano on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because Casey still needed to get through the Clementi Sonatina, and because she'd realized somewhere in the wreckage of that week that the parts of her life that felt smallest were often the parts that had kept her steadiest. She and Bennett went to see a marriage counselor in a strip mall near their duplex, a woman named Odalise Ferris who had a soft voice and a habit of letting silences sit far longer than either of them was comfortable with. In one of those sessions, Bennett said something Junie still thinks about. He said he hadn't canceled the flight because he thought she was lying to him about anything. He'd cancelled it because his own father had lost their house to a bad deal when Bennett was 11, something that looked official and legitimate right up until it wasn't, and some part of him had spent his whole adult life terrified of watching someone he loved get taken advantage of the same way, without seeing it coming. He said it in a small voice, not looking at either of them, and Junie realized that the wall she'd built to protect herself had been standing directly across from a wall he'd built for entirely different reasons, and neither of them had ever really looked at what was on the other side. That didn't fix everything instantly. Trust doesn't work that way, and this channel has never pretended it does. There were weeks that spring where Bennett felt like a stranger in his own marriage, unsure how to talk to a woman who was suddenly fielding calls from board members about fuel contracts and depot closures. There were weeks where Junie resented having to explain herself, having to prove that the wall was down now, when for 6 years she'd been the one deciding when and how much to reveal. Marguerite, who had quietly become something like a second mother to both of them, told Junie once over the phone that trust rebuilt after a mistake is never the same shape as trust that was never broken, and that this wasn't a tragedy, it was just true, the way a bone heals stronger at the break but never looks quite the way it did before. There was one afternoon in April that Junie thinks of more than the others when people ask her how they got through that stretch. She had come home from a 2-day trip to Traverse City exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that settles behind your eyes, and she found Bennett in the kitchen with the ledgers spread across the table, not her mother's originals, those stayed locked in a cabinet in Michigan, but copies Roman Castellano's office had sent over so Junie could study them at home. Bennett wasn't reading them for numbers. He was reading the handwritten notes in the margins, in Dorothea's small, slanted handwriting, notes about which drivers had new babies, which depot manager's wife was sick, which routes needed rearranging so a father could make it home for his son's Friday night games. He looked up when she came in and said, quietly, that he thought he finally understood what kind of woman had raised her, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long to want to know. Junie sat down across from him and they went through the rest of the ledger together, and it wasn't a grand reconciliation, nobody cried, nobody made speeches. It was just two tired people at a kitchen table on a Tuesday, reading about a life neither of them had fully understood, and choosing to sit with it together instead of separately, which by that point in the spring had started to feel like the whole point. Odalise Ferris, the counselor, had a phrase she used more than once in their sessions that stuck with both of them. She said most marriages don't break because of one big betrayal. They erode because of 100 small decisions made alone that should have been made together, where to eat, what to tell your mother, whether to cancel a flight that looked strange at 6 in the morning. She wasn't interested in assigning blame for the airport, not really. She kept steering them back to the 6 years before it, the quiet ways Junie had learned to manage her husband's comfort by managing what he knew, and the quiet ways Bennett had learned to manage his own fear by managing decisions before anyone could question them. Neither habit had come from a bad place. Both of them, she said, had just been solving old problems using tools that didn't fit the marriage they actually had anymore. Bennett didn't love hearing that. He said once, half joking, that he'd signed up for couples counseling and ended up doing therapy about his father instead, and Odalise told him that was usually how it went. By early summer, something had settled. Bennett started coming with her to Traverse City on the weekend she had to be there, not to sit in on meetings, but because he'd started genuinely liking the drivers he'd met, men who reminded him, in some ways, of his own father before things went wrong, men who talked to him like a person instead of like Dorothea Kessler's son-in-law. He got to know Ansel over a few long drives and learned, eventually, that Ansel had flown Dorothea to 100 small funerals over the years, drivers' fathers, depot managers' wives, and had never once mentioned it to anyone because Dorothea believed showing up quietly mattered more than being seen doing it. Bennett started to understand, slowly, the kind of family he'd married into, not the money, which still made him uneasy in ways he was honest about, but the particular, stubborn belief that had run through both Dorothea and her daughter, that the way you treat people who can't do anything for you says more about you than anything else ever will. Junie eventually told him the rest of it, not just the money, but why she'd hidden it, the conversation from years earlier about his old roommate, the fear she'd carried since she was a teenager that being known as wealthy meant never fully knowing if you were loved for yourself. Bennett didn't defend the old comment. He just said he was sorry she'd carried that alone for 6 years, and that he wished she'd trusted him with it sooner, and that he understood, a little better now, why she hadn't. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. The following autumn, Northgate Freight Systems opened a small scholarship fund for the children of its drivers, something Junie had been quietly working toward for months, using her mother's old ledgers as a guide for which routes and which families had been with the company longest. She named it after nobody in particular, because that was how her mother would have wanted it done. At the small ceremony announcing it, held in the same fellowship hall where the funeral reception had been, Bennett stood near the back with coffee that was, once again, too weak, and watched his wife speak to a room full of people who had, over the past year, started calling her by her first name instead of Mrs. Kessler's daughter. Marguerite sat in the front row in a different rose-colored jacket. Roman Castellano came, briefly, out of what Junie suspected was genuine fondness rather than obligation. Ansel didn't say much, but he stood near the door the whole time, the way he used to stand near Dorothea, and Junie noticed him wipe his eyes once, quickly, when she mentioned her mother's name. Comment: kindness still exists, if you believe even one good act can change someone's life. Bennett still checks the shared email account too often, out of habit more than fear now. Junie still teaches piano on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Casey, eventually, did get through that sonatina, though it took most of the year. They still live in the top half of the duplex on Furwood Street, though they've started talking, carefully, about whether they'll stay there, and neither of them is in a hurry to decide. What changed wasn't the size of anything, not the house, not the bank account, not even really the marriage in any way you could point a camera at. What changed was smaller and steadier than that. It was the space between two people who had each spent years quietly protecting the other from something, learning, slowly and without any single dramatic moment to mark it, how to just tell each other the truth instead. Bennett never did get an apology from anyone for the confusion at that airport, and he never asked for one. He says, now, that the worst part wasn't the embarrassment of running across a tarmac shouting at his own wife in front of strangers. The worst part was realizing how easy it had been to make a decision about someone he loved without asking her first, all in the name of protecting her, and how much smaller that made his idea of protection look once he understood what she'd actually been carrying. That's not a lesson that arrives with fireworks. It arrives slowly, usually while you're doing the dishes or driving somewhere ordinary, and it tends to stay. Some kindness looks like showing up for a stranger's funeral so their family isn't alone in the room. Some of it looks like a scholarship fund named after no one. And some of it, the quieter kind, looks like two people deciding, again and again, on ordinary Tuesdays, to keep telling each other the truth even after they've already gotten it wrong once. That's the kind this story is really about.